Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to D.G. Wills Books in La Jolla, California. Tonight we're honored to have Dr. Gideon Rappaport, San Diego's premier Shakespearean dramaturge, who will discuss his new book, Appreciating Shakespeare. Dr. Rappaport has taught Shakespeare at Hamilton College, the State University of New York, Concordia University, University of New Hampshire, and at the Bishop School and La Jolla Country Day School, as well as UCSD, University of San Diego, and the San Diego Shakespeare Society. Dr. Rappaport has also served as theatrical dramaturge for the Old Globe Theater, the California Shakespeare Festival, the British American Youth Festival Theater, the San Diego Rep, North Coast Rep, the Intrepid Theater, the Poor Players, the New Fortune Theater Country, the Coronado Community Theater, as well as on school productions for the Bishop School and La Jolla Country Day School. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Gideon Rappaport.
That's so impressive. I want to hear what this guy has to say. All right. So first of all, I want to say thank you to Krizara and to Dennis for inviting me, arranging it and doing it to get me to speak tonight. My friend Courtney, I don't see her here. Are you here, Courtney? No. She said, well, she didn't say this, but I say that she thinks I have two speeds, abstract philosophical and fuss budget. So she said, tell some jokes. So I'm going to start with a couple of jokes. They're old Jewish jokes. They're about Texans. And they will sort of introduce the theme of my talk. But they're mostly just funny and meaningful. And if you've heard them before, it doesn't matter. You have heard them before. That doesn't matter. Because it just means you're well educated. So the first one is about a Texan who's visiting in Israel. He's a rancher. And he's talking to this Israeli, and he says, you know, I can get in my car in the morning, and I drive, and I drive, and I drive. And by lunchtime, I'm not even at the end of my property. And then I can turn around and go the other way. And I drive, and I drive, and I drive. And I'm still, by nighttime, not at the end of my property. And the Israeli says, oh, you know, I know. I had a car like that once. The other one you all know already, so you'll chime in at the punchline. Another Texan in a big car with horns on it is in New York, and he's got tickets. And he's trying to find Carnegie Hall and gets lost. And he ends up in the Lower East Side. And he finally says, I got to stop a guy and ask how to get there. So he stops an old Jew on the corner. And he says, how do I get to Carnegie Hall? And the Jew says, what? I'm trying to get to Carnegie. How do I get to Carnegie Hall? And the Jew says, practice. The Texan and the Israeli are talking about two completely different things. They have two completely different frames of reference. So one says, it takes me all day to get to the end of my property, and the other says, I've done that because that's because of the car. Okay, one's talking about the bigness of his ranch, he's bragging, and the other is talking about a miserable old car. So they're at cross purposes because they're talking about different things. In the second one, they're talking about the same thing. They're talking about Carnegie Hall, and Carnegie Hall means the same thing to everybody. A great performer is going to perform a great piece of music. The difference is the Texan has tickets and wants to sit in the audience and listen, and the old man thinks the only reason to go to Carnegie Hall is to perform there. All those Jewish kids learning their piano lessons and violin. So those are that's a paradox where there are two different points of view on the same thing, the same content. Now I'm going to give you a visual paradox. I used to start with this all the time when I was teaching What's So Great About Shakespeare. I once saw this picture of this thing in a magazine, and a friend, unbeknownst to me, ordered it and borrowed it, bought it for me. I'm not approving of doing this to moths, but this is a moth called Caligo brasiliensis. Caligo brasiliensis. Brazilian darkness. So if you come up and look close, you'll see it's a moth. It's a dead moth, but it's a moth. However, if I turn it this way.
Oh my God, it looks like an owl.
Wow.
What is it?
Owl.
Ow. Wow. Oh my God.
It's a moth. It looks like an owl. What does that mean? That forces us to another level of understanding of reality. It's a moth. We know it's a moth. That's a fact. It looks like an owl. That's also a fact. It's an equal fact. And how can that happen? So the room will be divided into two kinds of people, each depending on what your answer to that question is. You'll say either evolution, survival, etc. In other words, physical things generating this paradox for us. Or you'll say God painted this owl onto this moth in order to protect it from other kinds of predators and for our entertainment and whatever other reason he might have, which we can't fathom. But it's a created being and created to be paradoxical. It doesn't matter which of those two, well, it ultimately matters, but it doesn't matter for my purposes which of those two you hold. The experience is the same. It's an experience of paradox that requires us to take a step to a higher level of understanding of how these both can be true. And we have to live with it. There's no denying that it's a moth, and there's no denying that it looks like an owl. So that's what we have to live with. As Mary said, if you can't live with paradox, you're going to have a hard life. All right. I'm going to give you some other paradoxes that we live with. We've got a body, and we have something for which the best word that we have is soul, whatever that means to you. They aren't the same thing. We know they're not the same thing any more than a moth and an owl are the same thing, except for those few people who have had these out-of-body soul experiences that don't involve the body. And we'd have to interpret that too. We don't have general experience of the one without the other. If we're experiencing our body, it's our soul experiencing it. If our body is in conflict with, say, moral principles, then we're experiencing the soul and the body in conflict. But we have to figure out how to live harmoniously with both of them. They are both facts. We can't deny them. We have a self and we have a physicality, and they're not the same thing. There's yin and there's yang. So I'm not going to go into the whole Taoist philosophy, but it's a profound one. And the great Tai Chi symbol of the double teardrops with the dot of each and the other is a kind of image of reality. It's an image of the whole thing. But the whole thing is experienced by us as these two opposites, the yin and the yang, the dark and the light, the feminine and the masculine, the receptive and the aggressive, and so on. And they're both true, and they're both related to each other, but not in a way of identity, but in a way of, symbiosis, let's say. You can list 1,000 more paradoxical realities, pain and pleasure. Socrates says, oh, that feels so good when you take the leg irons off my leg just before he dies. And how pain and pleasure are related to each other. When you're in pain and it stops, that's pleasure. Or when you're in pleasure and that stops, for whatever reason, then that's pain. You lose something. There's justice and mercy. Anybody who's taught a classroom of kids or ruled any organization knows that you must temper justice with mercy. With no justice, everybody runs wild. With no mercy, you knock off everybody. So there have to be both, and the balance between them, Shakespeare wrote about this a lot, is difficult. It's not obvious and it's not clear, but they're both true. They're both necessary, they're both facts, and we have to live with both. There's left brain and right brain, very complicated set of ideas, which I won't go into either. And then T.S. Eliot has a very profound paradoxical prayer in Ash Wednesday. He says, teach us to care and not to care. Now, if you think about that for 10 seconds, you realize that it's one of the most profound prayers you can utter. Teach us to care and not to care. Yeah, but when? Like now? Which one? Okay, that's what we have to live with. And what's the greatest paradox of all that we have to live with? It's just the fact of our lives all the time. We live for some reason, and then we die. And we know it. We're the only ones that know it. We are the only ones that live who know we're going to die. And we have to live with it. We can live with it well, or we can live with it badly, but we have to live with it. So paradox is built into the nature of reality. I promise I'm going to get to Shakespeare. What is the English teacher's great paradox that every student writer gets on a paper? 10th grade on, maybe 8th grade on. The teacher on every paper for young writers will say two things. One, what's the point? Or, in English teacher talk, what's your thesis? What are you trying to say here? It's all over the place. You don't know what you're trying. Tell me what your point is, so everything else will. And then the next thing she writes on the paper is, be specific. You're abstracting your way through this whole paper, and you haven't shown me that it's true. You have to be specific. You have to nail it down. So the student writer thinks, well, what are you asking of me? Which do you want? You want me to give you the point, or you want me to be specific? And the teacher's answer is both. Because without both, it's no good, the paper. We've got to know where it's going, and we've got to be convinced that it's true. And the only way you convince us is by embedding that abstract idea in the particular details, or be specific. All right. So what's my point? I wrote this book. Well, I'll give you the presenting cause and then the underlying cause. The presenting cause, as I say in the preface, was my student said to me one day, we love your Shakespeare teaching in your class. Why don't you write a book for the people who aren't your students? And I didn't have an answer, so I wrote the book. But what's my point? What's the point of the book? I wrote the book to share the aha-erlebnis, the aha experience of appreciating Shakespeare's work. How can I get people who read Shakespeare or go to the theater to get it, to appreciate it? So one of the great paradoxes that Shakespeare resolves in his works is how to do the two seemingly opposite things that Aristotle recommended for any work of art. What are they, do you know? To entertain and instruct. So if you go to my Shakespeare class and I say, I'm going to instruct you in Shakespeare, you leave. And if you go to my Shakespeare class and I say, I'm going to entertain you all semester, you also leave. You want instruction with entertainment. That's why I had to start with jokes. Shakespeare does both at once. It's the great and necessary paradox of art. He entertains us with a play about real people with names and places and characteristics that we believe in when we're watching it. And at the same time, he makes those characters a window, an experience of reality that is then meaningful to us. In one set of words, Shakespeare fulfills both the English teacher's requirements. He is specific and he conveys his point, or points. That is, the plays give us the vivid experience of something we all crave, namely meaning. The vivid experience is be specific. And what we all crave, meaning, is what's the point? And the meaning in a work of Shakespeare is not that it means anything to anyone, which is one of the modern heresies about reading literature, that whatever you happen to want to say about the work is valid. No, there's a whole lot of nonsense. J.V. Cunningham, my professor and a great American poet said about Hamlet, and I quote him in my next book, "There is less to be said about Hamlet than has been said." And he's right. So the meaning in a work of Shakespeare is not that it means anything to anyone, but that it means something to everyone. To the Texan, to the Israeli, to the old Jew on the street corner, to everyone here, to everyone. Because it's, well, not because it's universal because it does that. It means that to everyone. So part 2 of Appreciating Shakespeare, this book, is my discussion of specific plays, 22 plays, and a selection of sonnets, as a way of conveying to the reader what is the meaning, or how to get to the meaning that Shakespeare is embedding in this experience of the play. But the point is that it's in the play, so there's a danger in reading my book. I don't want you to read my book instead of reading Shakespeare. Okay? That would just go against the whole purpose. The purpose is to get you ready to experience the play or poems and enjoy them and appreciate them and learn from them all together as an experience. This is something like the relation between the soul and the body. We could call it incarnation if we didn't want to go to the theological meaning of it, but just to the practical meaning of incarnating in flesh, a meaning that is invisible otherwise. And that's what Shakespeare's doing. So don't fall into the trap of substitution of my chapter on a play for seeing the play or reading the play. And I will illustrate that with an apocryphal story about either Beethoven or Schumann. I've heard it told about each. So it might never have happened, but it's in its essence, it's true. Beethoven is performing a sonata at a soiree with a bunch of people like you sitting in an elegant room, and he plays this sonata, and then afterwards there's conversation, and a woman comes up to him and says, "Herr Beethoven, that was so beautiful, but tell me, what does it mean?" No. And his response was, "Madam, this is what it means." And he sat down, he played it again. Why? Because if he could tell her what it meant, he wouldn't have to be a composer and a musician. He would just be able to tell her. It doesn't work. The thing is in it. So you have to have the experience of the Shakespeare play to get what I'm talking about in my book. But with the help of my book, you will appreciate it more. That's the title, Appreciating Shakespeare, more than you would otherwise. So that's part 2. It's an elucidation of the point, not a substitute for reading or seeing or hearing a live performance. Okay, fine. But what is part 1? It's a way of bringing the Texan and the Jew to appreciate the same point about Carnegie Hall. It's the music, right? They're both talking about the same thing, a great performance by a great musician of a great composer's work. Okay. The Texan expects to hear and the Jew to perform the same great concerto for the sake of the experience of the music itself. So I wrote part 1 of Appreciating Shakespeare to, so to speak, get you successfully into the concert hall, whether you're coming to listen or perform. That's maybe carrying the metaphor a little too far. Shakespeare's meanings that matter, and his meanings are the same for Texans and Jews and everyone else. All right. Now, how many of you have heard of Henry J. Kaiser?
Well, of course. Of the Kaiser automobile or the company that made aluminum?
Same one.
Same one.
Same man. Aluminum, Kaiser Steel, Kaiser Automobile, Kaiser Permanente, the Kaiser Resort in Hawaii. He helped build the Hoover Dam too.
Wow.
So he said the following: when your work speaks for itself, don't interrupt. So I'm going to stop interrupting and I'm going to read something from this book. Shakespeare's plays represent a remarkable union of 2 modes of drama. For convenience, we can call the first mode realism and the second allegory. As mentioned above, Shakespeare has found a way to make completely believable particulars convey completely meaningful ideas. Okay, that's the incarnation I was talking about. The effect is that the audience experiences his characters' actions, situations, and speeches as real and believable, and at the same time, universally significant. Most writers who are good at one of these modes of drama are less effective at the other. Shakespeare is great at both, and at both at the same time. In achieving this marriage of naturalistic realism and abstract allegory, he comes as close to imitating life truly seen as any artist we can name. And this is why everybody is moved by Shakespeare and loves his plays. Shakespeare achieves this combination, as C.S. Lewis argues, partly through the use of the technique of variation, which will be discussed under Variation in Speech in Chapter 4. Another way of looking at this is to think about Shakespeare's position in the history of drama. So I'm just going to give you a brief outline. The history of European drama from medieval times to the present is generally, with exceptions, a movement from more allegorical to more slice of life, realistic. The dramatic forms of our modern age began in the churches with stories that everyone knew and that applied to everyone. Bible stories like those about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, Noah's flood and the birth of Jesus, stories about the lives of saints, morality tales like Everyman, a play about the fact that every human being dies and goes to judgment. In that allegorical play, characters have names of abstract concepts like knowledge, good deeds, death, so on. And the main character, Everyman, is neither short nor tall, nor fat nor thin, unusually good nor unusually bad. He has no particular qualities at all, except that of being a mortal man. Therefore, he stands for all of us. Now fast forward to the present day and think of the movies and TV shows you watch. The vast majority of them are about specific people with specific names and ages in specific places and situations. They even drink specific drinks. The Coca-Cola bottling company, for example, pays a lot of money to get the hero of the latest popular film to be seen drinking a Coke instead of water, let alone Pepsi. We tend to take far more seriously a movie or TV show that might begin, for example, with a boy named Joe Morgan driving along Chicago's outer drive in his father's silver Honda and talking on the cell phone to a girlfriend named Cindy, than one that begins, once upon a time there was a boy who lived in a big city. We go for the more particular or realistic. But Shakespeare came right in the middle of the historical movement from the one mode toward the other. And he and his audience, partly instructed by him, went for both together. We could draw a schematic, and that's what I do. So you'll see on page 16 the schematic, and it goes, you can see it's indented as I go down the page. Church liturgy, mystery plays, morality plays, miracle plays, early Renaissance histories, tragedies, and comedies, those that Shakespeare most immediately inherited, Shakespeare in the middle, and then Restoration comedies and 18th century satires and tragedies, 19th century melodrama, 20th and 21st century drama, film, TV, and we can keep going. Docudramas, news, documentaries, reality TV, live video and webcams. Stop! The causes of this movement from the abstract to the particular are complex and mysterious, having to do with the ways in which human civilization and its styles develop. The movement is significantly influenced by Shakespeare's work itself. But what is important here is to see that Shakespeare comes at the center or pivot point of this historical development, both in terms of his place in the history of drama and in terms of the qualities of his plays themselves. The union of modes we've been talking about, realistic particulars and universal significance, is the essence of Shakespeare's drama. Remember the Donald Duck cartoons where he's got a decision to make and an angel Donald appears on one shoulder and a devil Donald on the other, right? And one wants him to do the right thing and one wants him to do the wrong thing, and they're arguing with each other. That's a great old medieval trope called the psychomachia, the war within the psyche, the war within the soul. And Shakespeare wrote one, or more than one, and it's called Othello. And who's the good angel on one shoulder? Desdemona, his virtuous wife. And who's the evil angel on the other shoulder? Iago, his villainous ensign. And they're battling for the soul of Othello. And I won't give away too much by saying that it's a tragedy, which means that Iago wins over the soul of Othello. But of course, he's eternally damned for it. Take one more example. Sir John Falstaff in Henry IV, Part 1, is a hilariously witty, self-indulgent, old, fat man whose rank as a knight is entirely at odds with his character. He is devoted to his own comfort and pleasure, eating, drinking, sleeping, thieving, whoring, and joking around, and has lots of fun pretending to be virtuous and brave when he definitely isn't, providing us some of the best laughs in the history of drama. I do not take anything away from the hilarity and brilliance of Falstaff. He is one of Shakespeare's most completely convincing achievements in realism. You know Falstaff, you've never met anyone who is Falstaff, but you know him. And you know him as well as you know the person sitting next to you. He's not confusable with anybody else. At the same time, in the context of the play, Falstaff also represents that part in every human being that is attached to the pleasures of the body and the selfish ego, the part that would be perfectly happy to see truth, loyalty, and honor tossed away in favor of fun and pleasure. To our utter delight, Falstaff is both his own utterly believable self and an incarnation of, in Renaissance physiological terms, the sanguine complexion, that is, fat, jolly, and red-faced like Santa Claus. In Plato's terms, the vegetable soul, and in Christian terms, complete worldliness. Banish plump Jack, he says of himself, and banish all the world. And the prince, of course, says, pretending to be his father, I do. And then, being himself, says, I will. And he does. And he has to, because Falstaff is a disintegrator of the order of the realm. And it would destroy the realm to let him continue in the influence over the prince. Recognition of this universal realism, this both in oneness, realistic particulars united with abstract universals, reveals Shakespeare at his greatest. It is one of the most valuable keys to unlocking the wonders of Shakespeare's drama. The central purpose of this book is to enable you to access the great experiences of meaning that Shakespeare provides us through the medium of his works. Those meanings cannot be stated in sentences that try to state the meaning of the play. That's what the problem Beethoven had with that woman. They can, however, be found if you let Shakespeare guide you to each play's center. All that is needed is a willingness to study the author's language and to become familiar with the author's assumptions, to adopt them for a little while as you read or see his work. If you do so, you will come to the center of each play and there find its meaning for yourself. Then you can decide whether the reward has been worth the effort. So part 1 of this book is to get you able to do that. I teach you the language of poetry, and I teach you the background ideas that Shakespeare brought to his plays so that you know what the context of the words he's using is, and therefore can understand it in his terms first. And that brings you to see how it's universally significant. If you ignore that and just interpret them from a modern point of view, getting the words wrong and getting the ideas wrong, then you may like what you think Shakespeare's saying, but it's not Shakespeare saying it, it's you saying it to yourself. And Shakespeare's Adams. Okay. Next part. Let's go to page 39. This one's called, Did People Really Talk Like That? How many of you have asked me that question? Okay, you don't want to admit it. One person admits it. All of you. Yes and no. The answer is yes and no. They didn't need the footnotes we do because for them Shakespeare's language was not 400 years old. Words that seem unusual to us were usual to them. Mead means reward. Pard means leopard. Saw meaning axiom. Zounds meaning I swear by his, i.e. Christ's wounds. Some words have changed their meaning since Shakespeare's time. Still meant always. Jealous meant suspicious. Stomach meant appetite. On the other hand, Shakespeare invented a lot of words that his own audience had never heard before. They got the meaning, as we do, from the context. Consanguineous, from Twelfth Night. Fathomless, Troilus and Cressida. And retirement. That's a nice word to have. Like these, most of the words Shakespeare invented, we still use today. But the biggest difference between the stage speech and street speech in Shakespeare's day was that the people in his audience did not usually speak in poetry. What the heck is poetry? The best definition of poetry that I can come up with, you're going to think it's another paradox, and you're right. Poetry says with words what cannot be said in words. Poetry says with words what cannot be said in words. You need the poem to do the thing to the reader that you want to get done. Just as Beethoven needed that sonata to convey the experience of the meaning of the sonata, and he couldn't do it in words. So poetry unites words and music to give an experience. Poetry is a medium of getting across an experience of meaning in a way that normal language cannot do. It does so by expressing thought, not only through the literal meanings of words, but through the complex interrelation of the meanings, associations, and sounds of words. In short, through the use of rhetorical devices, also called figures of speech, like metaphor and simile, rhythm and rhyme, antithesis and repetition, and many more. I'm working on two books at the same time, by the way. So I'm editing Hamlet. That's going to come out, I hope, by the end of the year. And I've done a book of a list of the figures of speech that Shakespeare uses, over 200 of them, based on Sister Miriam Joseph's book. And it's got at the back an alphabetical list with pronunciation and definition, brief definition. And then it's keyed to the examples from Shakespeare that I give. And I give examples from each figure of speech. So I'm hoping people will find that valuable. Okay. These figures of speech, these devices, are not foreign to our daily speech. We often use them unconsciously. Where can I catch the bus to San Diego? Sounds like prose. It's a 5-beat line containing varied rhythm. A visual image, catch. That's metaphor. A repetition of initial consonants, can, catch, see alliteration. Repetition of vowel sounds, can, catch, san, see assonance. An internal rhyme, can and san, see rhyme. The difference is that the poet uses figures of speech like these elaborately and with intention. Through the complex combination of such rhetorical devices, poetry extends and deepens our responses to the meanings of sentences. I'm going to give you one example, and then we can talk about the poem it comes from later if you want. Here's an example of how one might express in normal speech an idea from one of Shakespeare's sonnets. The more we trust a friend who seems to merit our trust, the more we are disappointed if he or she later betrays us. True enough. This is a clear and familiar idea, and we can all understand it. But unless we are particularly vulnerable to the idea at a given moment, it doesn't move us much. We say true and let it go. But watch what happens when Shakespeare expresses the idea in the verse couplet concluding Sonnet 94. For sweetest things turn sourest by their deeds. Lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds. Okay, now you didn't have that reaction to my prose sentence. Why? Because it wasn't rhyming, it wasn't alliterative, it wasn't assonant, all the other. Okay, what's the difference? The second passage creates an entirely different kind of experience in us. We respond to the first version with understanding, but minimal personal engagement or excitement. But in the second version, the words convey more than information. Reading and hearing them, especially after reading the first 12 lines of the sonnet, becomes an intense personal experience. In our response, we empathically smell the sweetness of that lily turned to the foul smell of rot. The change of feelings we have when someone betrays our affection or trust has been incarnated, that is, given a body in our mental and emotional experience by evoking in words the physical experience of rotting flowers. We not only think the idea for a moment, we live it. So that's why people write poetry, because it says with words what cannot be said in words. Did Shakespeare's audience get it all? Page 65. We have Shakespeare's own word that they did not. Check out the prologue to Romeo and Juliet, Act 1, where the chorus says, "If you with patient ears attend, what here shall miss, our toil shall strive to mend." In other words, the speaker of the prologue says to the audience, whatever you miss in this prologue, you'll catch later if you pay attention. So Shakespeare himself knew that some audience members were bound to be missing some things. But the question is more complicated. When we study Shakespeare's language in all the ways discussed above and others, we may wonder whether Shakespeare's audience could possibly have been aware of this complexity and richness and variety. Were they sitting or standing in the Globe Theatre registering these elements that we observe when we are looking closely at the text of a play? Again, the answer is both no and yes. They certainly are not counting the stresses of iambic pentameter lines when Romeo is observing Juliet on her balcony. Nor are they thinking, aha, chiasmus, when Richard II is about to surrender the English crown. How many of us, when watching a movie, are measuring the cinematographer's camera angles or noting his lighting system? You are, but the rest of us aren't. We can certainly become conscious of these things when we study a movie in detail, and that study may well enrich our appreciation of the movie as a work of art. But when we are watching it for entertainment, those elements disappear into the whole experience. The same was true for Shakespeare's audience. Nonetheless, they were conscious of clarity, the fitness, and the authenticity of the play they were hearing. They would surely have felt uncomfortable if the lines failed to scan, or a young man in love spoke in language appropriate to an old nurse, or a noble duke started speaking in comical malapropisms. In other words, they got it all as we get the meaning and quality of a movie, even if we are not film critics or experts in the art of cinematography. They got it because Shakespeare was all of a piece. Every element of language contributed to the total meaning and effect of the play. His audience could feel the quality of the whole in every part, and so can we if we ready ourselves to receive the experience as it was intended to be received. Hence the purpose of my book. Why all the footnotes? Okay, well, the first part of that is words we don't know, and I list some, and then words we think we know, but they've changed their meanings. I already gave you some of those. But now I want to give you a little fantasy that I wrote called Shakespeare and Electricity. Imagine that Shakespeare is suddenly conveyed by a time machine to the present. Sitting in a bar, which he would call a tavern or an alehouse, he overhears two men in conversation. One says, "My supervisor blew a fuse today when his website froze." The other says, "You think that's bad? My girlfriend just pulled the plug on our relationship." What does Shakespeare think they mean? From the Latin, he would know that a supervisor is someone who looks over something. But blow a fuse? He would guess that fuse was from Latin, but he would have no idea that to blow a fuse is a metaphor for losing one's temper. If you've grown up only with circuit breakers, some of you, maybe, perhaps even you may need a footnote to define the word fuse as used by the man in the bar. Does everybody know what a fuse is? Pre-circuit breaker fuse? Okay. When his website froze might bring to Shakespeare's mind the image of winter cold freezing a spidery place, or, metaphorically, a place where the overlooker had laid a trap. In other words, he'd have it all wrong. He would feel that the phrase made no sense and want a footnote, which he would call a gloss. So far, the need for a footnote for the sake of Shakespeare's understanding is obvious. But now, let's look further. Let's assume he could guess the meaning of girlfriend and relationship. But what about pulled the plug? Shakespeare didn't use the word plug, which came to English later in Shakespeare's life from the Dutch for what he would have called a bung, the wooden stopper in the opening or bung hole of a barrel. If indeed he had heard the word, Shakespeare might at first suppose that the girlfriend had pulled out the stopper of a beer barrel to celebrate with endless drink. But then, seeing the man's unhappiness, he would imagine the man's metaphor to mean that the couple's affection was slowly draining away like beer from a barrel. Glug, glug, glug. Not instantaneously vanished, as we would think, imagining the electric plug of a lamp or a TV or a computer suddenly jerked out of the wall socket. Here, Shakespeare would think he knew what the man meant. Not realizing his image was off the mark, he would not look for a footnote. What would you have to do to explain to Shakespeare what these men at the bar really did mean? You might say, you have to think about lights and computers and stuff. You know, electricity. What? Says Shakespeare. The power that comes out of the wall socket to run things. Power from the wall? Are you talking about spirits? Phew, this is going to be harder than you thought. And not because Shakespeare is stupid. You realize you've got to start from the beginning. You will have to explain our ideas about lightning, describe Ben Franklin with the key on his kite, mention the inventor Thomas Alva Edison, generators, batteries, the Hoover Dam, power lines on telephone poles, and insulated copper wire. You can tell them about radio waves and smartphones in a graduate seminar later. After a few hours of explanation, Shakespeare will say one of two things. A, I think I'm beginning to get what they meant by blew a fuse and pulled the plug. Or B, you must be out of your mind. And so it is with us, trying to understand Shakespeare. We share a language with him and do understand a vast majority of his words. But unless we become familiar with the ideas he took for granted, as we take electricity for granted, we will come away from reading and hearing his words with many misconceptions about what he meant. Moreover, the better we know a word, the more likely we are to be misled. Just as we need no footnotes on electricity to explain what pulled the plug means, so Shakespeare's audience needed no footnotes to know what the music of the spheres meant. But without an introduction to electricity, Shakespeare will hear web and plug and think of spiders and beer barrels. And without a similar introduction, we hear music of the spheres and think of wind chimes or some musical instrument made of metal balls. In this chapter, this is chapter 7, why all the footnotes, you will find brief explanations of a few of the fundamental shared ideas that Shakespeare and his audience took for granted, as we take electricity for granted. Being aware of these ideas will prepare you to understand Shakespeare in his own terms. This does not mean that Shakespeare's work is any less universal. He may not have known about electricity, and we may not think of the sky as crystalline spheres, but like him we can experience the wonder of the starry heavens on a clear night, and like us, he knew all about relationships and how they sometimes end. What Shakespeare is really talking about, body and soul, nature and society, good and evil, success and failure, this world and the next, and so on, are as relevant to us as to the audience of his own time. But our access to what he is saying about these subjects depends on understanding not only the words, but also the concepts through which they are expressed. So let's look at the worldview that is the context for all of Shakespeare's thinking. And then I do that. That's chapter 7. And it goes through some of those ideas. Okay. Now, I'm happy to stop if you've had enough, or I can teach you a couple of sonnets.
Sonnets.
Keep going? Okay. So I made copies just in case you said yes. Not marble nor the gilded monuments of princes shall outlive this powerful rhyme. But you shall shine more bright in these contents than unswept stone besmeared with sluggish time. When wasteful war shall statues overturn, and broils root out the work of masonry, nor Mars his sword, nor war's quick fire shall burn the living record of your memory. 'Gainst death and all oblivious enmity shall you pace forth. Your praise shall still find room even in the eyes of all posterity that wear this world out to the ending doom. So till the judgment that yourself arise, you live in this and dwell in lovers' eyes. All right, so this is a trope that Shakespeare made particularly popular and famous, namely that the beloved, the beauty of the beloved, lives on in the poem, if not in the world, because after a certain point, beauty goes away. Like Sonnet 18, Sonnet 55 seeks to immortalize the beloved, hereby presenting itself as a surer way of doing so than any physical monument can provide. One of the marvels of this sonnet, as of many others, is again the use of sound to convey and reinforce sense. So this is where I'm going to talk about the incarnation of meaning in sound, the wedding of our experience of words and sound and our understanding of what the words mean. They become one thing. The first two lines, not marble nor the gilded monuments of princes shall outlive this powerful rhyme, make a strong contrast between the last word of line 2, rhyme, and all the previous words. The series marble, gilded, monuments, princes, and powerful repeat the consonant sounds L, M, N, and R. That's called consonants. And the vowel sounds A, O, and U, and short I, that's called assonance, to build up a sense of gravity, weighty monumentality, that is then exploded by the contrasting long I of rhyme. This sudden contrast is assisted by the fact that all that monumentality is introduced by the negating words not and nor. Okay, I'm going to do a little side thing just to tell you, to give you an empathic experience of what I'm talking about. So I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to feel what it feels like. You're supposed to close your eyes. I want you to feel what it feels like when I say the word butterfly. Now I want you to feel what it feels like when I say the word hippo. What's the difference? What are you experiencing?
Size.
Everything. You're experiencing a physical reality that's absolutely opposed to the other thing. And so when we use words, this is all languages, doesn't matter what language, human beings associate the sound of the word with the meaning of the word. And so the poet can take those associations and manipulate them. So when he gives us all these heavy, monumental words, marble, gilded, monuments, princes, powerful, we feel the weight. And then he makes a contrast with the vowel sound of I in rhyme. And then, but you shall shine more bright in these contents than unswept stone besmeared with sluttish time. All right, I'm going to read on now. Uh-oh, I lost it. The next two lines pick up the long I of rhyme in the words shine and bright, adding the sharp T sound in bright and contents. These make a contrast with the mushy, slushy sounds of line 4, unswept stone besmeared with sluttish time. A slut is either a prostitute or a bad housekeeper. And he means the latter here. And time becomes this terrible housekeeper who's just rubbing the dirt around and making it muddy and worse. Why does he use that image? Because if you look at stones or marble with words carved in them as a monument to somebody, over time, what happens? They get mushed together. They stop being clear. You can't see them anymore. It's as if this sluttish woman has wiped them over with muddy cloth. What? Sluttish. So, all those sounds of the words, unswept stone besmeared with sluttish time. All those words in the mouth are the opposite of not marble nor the gilded monuments of princes, right? You can feel it. Okay. These make a contrast with the mushy, slushy sounds of line 4, unswept stone be smeared with sluttish, in which the wearing away of stone, a word that picks up the long O and N, and thus the monumentality of lines 1 and 2, again negates the value of physical monuments. And within the word time itself, the hard T from line 3 is dissolved in the M from lines 1 and 2. Time. T was it bright? You shall shine more bright in these contents. And then we get to time. So the sharp T, which is what does last and what shines bright, is dissolved in the M that comes from monuments and
Marble.
and rhyme. Okay. The result is a 4-line chiasmic series which expresses, what does chiasmus mean? It's an X, A, B, B, A structure. Yes, no, no, yes. Up, down, down, up. I mentioned before Richard II uses a chiasmus when he's giving up the crown. Are you contented to resign the crown? I, no, no, I. For I must nothing be. Therefore, no, no, for I resign to thee. So it's a chiasmus, and it's also a series of puns. So that's what chiasmus means. Mirror image, basically. The result is a 4-line chiasmic series which expresses A, the smearing of monuments in time, and B, the sharp brightness of the beloved preserved in the poem. Here the chiasmus ABBA, or mirror image structure, is A, not marble nor the gilded monuments of princes shall outlive this powerful. B, rhyme. B, but you shall shine more bright in these contents, sharp T's and long I's. A, than unswept stone be smeared with sluttish time. Okay, you get what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So he goes from the monumentality of the rock to the greater power of the rhyme and the brightness of the beloved as compared to the smearing of the monumentality of the rock. Line 4 creates in sound the equivalent of the smudging of lettering that time works upon stone, making a smeary fuzziness of sound corresponding to the smeary fuzziness of sight, and contrasting with it the vowel sound of rhyme and the sharp T sound of bright, that together represent the ever crisp and clear effect of the poem and of the beloved in it. Line 9. 'Gainst death and all oblivious enmity shall you pace forth. 'Gainst death and all oblivious enmity, the added unstressed or perhaps elided syllable on the second I in the word oblivious contrasts with the 2 spondies that begin line 10. What's a spondee? 2 stresses. An iamb is ba-bum, that's Shakespeare's main rhythm, ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. All this is in the book. And a spondee is bum-bum, which can only happen once or twice in a line. Otherwise, there's no meter. So he gives us this double spondee. Shall you pace forth? Bum, 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 bum. As opposed to against death and all oblivious enmity. Oblivious has these unstressed, elided syllables. What's the idea of oblivious? Time is making us oblivious of the greatness of these people remembered in these monuments. Against the smudging, smearing oblivion felt in the 4 short vowels in oblivious, which the enmity of time works upon physical monuments and consequently upon the memory of those recorded on them, we have shall you pace forth, the stride of those 4 equally stressed syllables reinforcing the meaning of the word pace. And those 2 spondees are followed by 2.5 lines whose enjambment makes the reader of the poem run almost out of breath by the last word doom, which itself can be drawn out until the breath is gone. Your praise shall still find room, even in the eyes of all posterity that wear this world out to the ending doom. You almost can't get to the end of the line. Or at my age, you can't. So we have the beloved pacing forth through the long declining history of the world to its end, represented in the long declining breath of the reader of the lines. Again, there is no substitute for reading the poem aloud. Shakespeare inherited the idea that things were best in their beginnings and the world was wearing out and becoming worse. In the last 10 years, I think he's probably right. Ending, doom, and judgment refer to the end of the world on the day of the last judgment, when, according to Christian doctrine, all the dead will be resurrected and judged by God. The final contrast of the poem, giving sound to the contrast between the wearing out of the world until doomsday and the perpetual living and shining of the beloved, is that between the M and long O sounds of room, posterity, world, out, doom, which pick up the sounds of the first two lines, marble, monuments, outlive, powerful, and the long I of arise and eyes, which pick up the sound of rhyme in line 2. So again, that same contrast. Until doomsday, then, the beloved will live in this, the poem itself that we are reading, living in the eyes of its readers who are lovers of their own beloveds, and reading the poem become lovers of the speaker's beloved too. Okay. One more? Yes? One more poem. Then I'll take questions. 146. There's a mistake in the first quarto printing of this poem. The typesetter duplicated a phrase, and what Shakespeare actually wrote is lost. And every editor since then till now has tried to come up with what that word was, and their attempts all prove that no one else in the universe, apart from Shakespeare, could write 1 foot of a Shakespearean verse. Here's what they did. Poor soul, the center of my sinful earth. The next line reads in the quarto, my sinful earth, these rebel powers that thee array. Now, how do we know that Shakespeare didn't intend to repeat the phrase? Because the next line with that phrase becomes a hexameter, not a pentameter. 6 feet instead of 5, and it doesn't fit the structure of the poem. And also, he's got too much to do in words. He can't afford to be repeating unless he really means to. So we know it's a typesetter's mistake, but we don't know what goes there. Thrall to, Lord of, there are probably 50 famous emendations of this 1 foot. So I'm just going to leave it blank. Poor soul, the center of my sinful earth, but bum, these rebel powers that thee array. Why dost thou pine within and suffer dearth, painting thy outward walls so costly gay? Why so large cost, having so short a lease, dost thou upon thy fading mansions spend? Shall worms, inheritors of this excess, eat up thy charge? Is this thy body's end? Then, soul, live thou upon thy servant's loss, and let that pine to aggravate thy store. Buy terms divine in selling hours of dross. Within be fed, without be rich no more. So shalt thou feed on death that feeds on men. And death once dead, there's no more dying then. This is perhaps the most philosophical of all the sonnets. Following in a long tradition, the poet presents a dialogue between the soul and the body. The Christian version of the tradition begins with St. Paul and is elaborated in St. Augustine's Confessions. Neoplatonic and humanist versions appear in Castiglione, Sidney, and others. Addressing his own soul, the speaker challenges it to learn detachment from the wealth and pleasures of the physical body in favor of storing up spiritual wealth. In line 1, the center of my sinful earth is a composite image. The earth is the center and lowest point of the universe in the old astronomy of Ptolemaic astronomy, and the center is that point at the center of the earth about which the heavenly spheres turn in circular motion. The earth is sinful because it is cursed since the fall of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. The soul is the center about which turns the earth, that is the sinful human body. Like the earth itself from which Adam was made, the body is sinful because of inborn original sin. That is, not created original sin, but original sin inborn since Adam and Eve's choice to eat of the fruit. In line 2, there is a typographical error. I've explained that already. The more the speaker spends on the fading mansion, that is his body, the more the soul is impoverished within. The metaphor is of a householder impoverishing himself by spending a fortune to decorate the outward walls of a mansion, the body, on which he has a short lease, and of which the heirs, inheritors, will be worms. The third quatrain offers the contemplation of physical death as the way of feeding the soul spiritually. This is in keeping with the long tradition of memento mori, remember that you will die, which stands behind the many paintings depicting saints and monks contemplating human skulls, and behind the contemplation of Yorick's skull in Act 5, Scene 1 of Hamlet. The speaker urges his soul to reverse the habit of line 3, and it's line 3 is, why dost thou pine within and suffer dearth? Dearth means lack. The speaker urges his soul to reverse the habit of line 3 and instead to let that, the body, pine in order, or waste away, in order to increase the soul's store of spiritual wealth. The word aggravate means add weight to, from the Latin gravis, meaning heavy. The sense of line 11, by terms divine and selling hours of dross, depends on understanding terms to mean long-term interest in an estate, contrasting with mere hours, so that the antitheses of the line are buy, selling, terms versus hours, and divine versus dross. By selling the few hours one has to live in the body, one will buy eternal life. The poet then extends the images of pining and dearth in line 3 and eating in line 8 to feeding of the soul itself. And the food is now death. Instead of letting itself be eaten away by death and focusing on the material concerns of the physical body, which death is eating away inevitably, the soul may instead contemplate, feed on death, and thereby tie itself to immortality. The last line of the couplet, and death once dead, there is no more dying then, is one of the most remarkable lines in all Shakespeare. It uses 3 versions of the same word. The figure of speech is called polyptoton. Death, dead, and dying. All but one of the line's words are monosyllables, and it uses but one metaphor of death being dead. Where it comes, the final phrase, there's no more dying then, is as simple, profound, and moving as any phrase in Shakespeare. It bears comparison with King Lear's Pray You Undo This Button, and with Leontes' Oh, She's Warm in The Winter's Tale. The couplet of this poem causes us to experience the very simplicity that the poem as a whole is advocating. The heavenly calm of its final phrase is as close as words can come to giving us an experience of the reward of contentment promised to those who let go of their attachment to the things of this world in favor of the things of the Spirit.
Bravo.
Thank you. I'll take questions if I may.
Talk about antithesis and how that conveys understanding for people who are...
Good. That's a great point. So all of Shakespeare, all of drama is built on antithesis, conflict. You have the good guys and the bad guys in some way or another. And drama consists of there being opposed intentions of characters. So who's going to win, or which is going to prevail? But Shakespeare, the whole body of Shakespeare's work is constructed of antitheses. And it's antitheses among characters and doublings of plots. So we have subplots as well as main plots. And in any line, the drama of the poetic line is built out of antithesis. So there's drama in the very structure of the sentences that Shakespeare is writing in verse in the plays. And our work with actors is to get them to see where the antitheses are and bring them out so that they can make the audience understand. So if I say, to be or not to be, that is the question, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the sea of troubles and, by opposing, end them. You don't understand a word I'm saying. But if I bring out the antitheses, you will. To be or not to be? That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the sea of troubles, and by approaching end them. Yes?
Yes.
You see the difference?
Yeah.
So that's the difference between a trained actor who's aware of antithesis, the figure of speech called antithesis, and one who is not, who's just trying to express something in the words that he's inventing for himself. And he needs to be trained to say, "Lo, Shakespeare knows what he wants you to do. You just have to let him do it through you." And so then the actor picks up on the antitheses and it becomes clear. Is that helpful?
Yes, it is.
And one of the things that I hear in what you're doing is that Shakespeare wants us to hold within a certain kind of tension and not resolve, as Hegel would, into a kind of transcendence. And now Hegel, a resolution to these conflicts. That at some level Shakespeare thinks the heart of drama really is experiencing in a very lived way that moment.
So yes, he knows about the conflict in drama and the dialectic of contrary ends. But he also believes in resolution. He believes in, so the endings of the plays resolve. When King Lear goes through his long arc of agony because of his initial spiritual blindness, paralleled by Gloucester's physical blindness, he has to suffer a very long time and very profoundly until he's able finally to ask for forgiveness and be reunited with Cordelia. But at the very end of the play, although many modern interpreters don't like it, he ends by seeing Cordelia alive. Now we know that she's not alive and that he is at one level imagining it. But we also know that the end of that long trajectory of suffering is not nothingness. It's not never, 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 never. It's look there, look there. So that it's as if he is dying and entering into a state where he is reunited ultimately with Cordelia. So, and the comedies have happy endings. The conflicts are resolved. The tragedies also have unhappy endings, but the conflicts are resolved. The villain gets punished. Now, Iago doesn't die, but it's because he's a devil. He's demonic, so he can't die. But he is prevented from doing any more harm in the context of the play. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it's not Hegel in the sense that dialectic is the ultimate reality. The ultimate reality is the resolution of dialectic, but it's resolved in the experience, not in a simple formula. Does that make sense?
Yep.
By reading, you said that.
Absolutely right. The best way is to see Shakespeare live and have the experience. There's no substitute for seeing the people on the stage doing what they're doing and saying what they're saying.
As long as they're reading it correctly.
The problem is that so many productions are poisoned by either misinterpretation or willful, intentional transformation of the meaning of the play, because my image of it is that that kind of director sets up a mirror on the stage. And in order to sell the play, he wants us to come in and see only what we bring in with us, nothing else. And he obscures what Shakespeare is bringing to us and what we might value from what Shakespeare has to say. But in a good production, and there have been many, you get a quality of experience that you can't get just by reading it, because you're not hearing it. Now, after years and years and years of working in the theater and teaching Shakespeare and hearing myself read it and seeing movies, and I can sit down and read a play and I hear it and it moves me. But I know what I'm doing, and I've read my book. So my goal with this book is to get you to be able to get closer to that experience reading the plays. But as I repeat several times in the book, better yet, go see a good production. But demand that it be a good production. And if it's, crap, walk out and let them know that you thought it was crap, because Shakespeare deserves better. Yeah, so reading is good, seeing it in a good production is even better.
What character in Shakespeare do you think embodies that?
They all do. My point
More
was,
so than anyone else.
well, I used Falstaff as an example. I mean, when Falstaff's on the stage, we totally believe in him as a person. But it's all Shakespeare's characters. They're not as realistic to us as modern slice of life drama, because we've gone a lot further along that historical trajectory than Shakespeare was. But they're a lot more realistic to us than the characters in Everyman, right? Who are named Good Deeds and Death and Fellowship and so on. They're just abstractions, whereas Shakespeare's characters are not just abstractions, but they also have an abstract meaning. So we believe in Iago's reality, but he's also a demon. And we believe in Othello's reality as a person, but he's also Adam, he's man, caught between these two contrary temptations or seduction, and has to decide how to behave. So what I was trying to say by naturalistic realism is to illustrate that Shakespeare is in a kind of pivot point between one extreme and the other, and embodies both in one experience.
If you could bring Shakespeare to today's favorite production and have him see it, given what he called for and what was looked for, what would his review be?
That's a really good question. So, first of all, he would say, these people are talking as if I'm overhearing them next door. They're not declaiming a poetic drama, because Shakespeare's poetry on the stage in his time, we would consider to be, people, they're just spouting declamation all over the place, right? They're going through the motions, and it was very stylized by comparison with our demand for realistic drama. The great thing about Shakespeare is that his poetry can stand up to our more realistic interpretation, so long as we keep to his meaning, and they are moving to us. But his critique would be, well, these people they're not trained to reach the back of the house, right? They're just whispering to each other and mumbling. Because many times, I mean, in bad productions it's even worse. You get actors trained with close-ups on the camera in Hollywood, and they come down to the Old Globe stage, and they know they have to be heard, so they shout the whole play, or they whisper and you can't hear them, or whatever. They hit pronouns because they're trying to be modern and dramatic, and it just gets in the way. But Shakespeare would definitely have thought of our acting as too much like common life and not poetical enough. You have to take into consideration the audience. He's smart enough to know that if he sees any other thing that we're doing in our time, that our way of doing, if we're doing it right, our way of doing Shakespeare works for this audience, just as his way of doing it worked for his audience. But if we tried to import our way of doing it into his time, it would fall flat. Nobody would, I mean, you guys aren't actors, you're just blabbing. Yes?
You subscribe to the feeling that Hamlet is his greatest character?
Let's say comparisons are odorous, but yes, one of the greatest. So, but profoundly misunderstood for the last 200 years, which is why I'm doing an edition of the play, to try to restore what I believe to be the moral, spiritual backbone of the play, the drama of Hamlet's life, and take away the false drama that people have imposed on the play. It's not a play about a man who couldn't make up his mind. That's what Olivier says in his film. It's not a play about a man who's in love with his mother, which is what Ernest Jones says about it under Freud's influence. It's not a play about a man who thinks too much. It's not any of that stuff that's been imposed on. It's a play about a man who's given a task by a ghost, and he's got to figure out if the ghost is telling the truth. And once he knows the ghost is telling the truth, he does something terrible. He has a dram of evil in him, and he makes a terrible mistake, a sin, a crime, an act of will that's poisonous and destructive. But by the end of the play, he is corrected by the experiences of his life. And it ends, of course, it ends tragically, but it ends in a redemptive tragedy. Of Shakespeare's 4 greatest tragic heroes, 2 are damned and 2 are redeemed. And so, yeah, it's one of the greatest. King Lear is the other. But Macbeth is also great. And Othello is also great. And so, but they're giving you an experience of a different trajectory, right? One is fall and rise, and the other is rise and fall. And they both are very compelling. Or all 4, I should say. And that's not to leave out the other tragedies. I could go on in detail, but yes, Hamlet is one of Shakespeare's very greatest characters. Whether he's the greatest, it's hard to know.
Did you like Branagh's interpretation?
I liked Branagh because he did the whole play. He didn't cut it. So that was great. He was in that okay. It was much better than Olivier, who made it all Freudian. However, Olivier's Henry V is much better than Branagh's Henry V because he doesn't poison it with modern false impositions on the play. So it just depends on the production. I liked the greatest Claudius in film is Branagh's Claudius, Derek Jacobi. But the Polonius was done all wrong. So, it's a mixed bag. Thank you for coming, really, on a night like that. I'd like you to sign some books, Gideon. Yes, absolutely. I'll sit or stand and sign books.